On August 9, 1995, Jerry Garcia died at a rehabilitation facility, aged 53. Medical examinations later showed that his arteries were 85% clogged, and his body had been progressively failing. However, a less widely known fact from a month before his death is that only 30 days earlier, he had performed at Soldier Field in a manner that seemed more like an act of revelation than mere entertainment. His voice broke on the final lines, and numerous concertgoers later observed that he appeared ghost-like. That evening, he was doing more than simply singing. He was expressing something deeply significant. Once you grasp what came from him during those final moments, the entire story of his life takes on a different meaning. Jerry Garcia was born in San Francisco's Excelsior District, an area filled with noise, activity, and coarse edges. Vehicles rumbled past, residents shouted in the streets, and taverns remained lively well into the night. Yet within his childhood residence, something proved even more forceful than the city surroundings. A strong combination of aspiration, disappointment, and most of all, music. His father, Joe Garcia, had arrived from Galicia, Spain, as a teenager. Joe was not a casual music lover. He had rigorously trained as a clarinetist, and once believed that talent could create a sustainable career. But circumstances got in the way. A conflict with the musicians' union pushed him away from that profession, and his hopeful dream slowly fell apart. To earn a living, Joe left the stage and took control of a downtown bar. Still, he never completely let go of what music signified to him. That wounded yet enduring dream stayed alive within the household. Perhaps that explains why he named his son Jerome, after Jerome Kern, the well-known Broadway composer. It was not just a label. It was a hope, a father trying to bestow a small sense of destiny onto his child. As a result, Jerry did not grow up seeing music as a simple pastime. He viewed it as something much larger and more serious. Both beauty and loss together, a force that could either raise a person up or completely let them down. His father's clarinet case remained a symbol of both desire and sacrifice. This contradiction settled deep inside Jerry before he could even put it into words. Music was neither secure nor sensible, yet it somehow still held more importance than anything else. When Jerry was only 4 years old, life turned harsh in a way that no child could comprehend. The family was in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and young Jerry was assisting with chopping wood. He was told to keep a piece of wood steady while his older brother swung the axe, a practice that seems shocking nowadays but was accepted back then. One terrible swing later, 2/3 of Jerry's right middle finger were sliced off. Blood, panic, and screams followed. His mother wrapped the injured hand in a towel, while his father drove over 30 miles to the closest hospital. Jerry wept for the whole trip. The immediate agony was intense, but the full realization took more time to settle in. Later, while sitting in a bath, he looked down and finally understood. The finger would never return. A piece of him had been permanently removed. That alone would have been enough childhood suffering, but worse was on its way, and it arrived rapidly. Less than a year afterward, the family went on a fishing trip near the Trinity River in Northern California, perhaps hoping for a calm day, a return to normality, or just some peace. Instead, Jerry witnessed his world break apart. His father stepped into the cold river to fly fish, slipped on a hidden rock, and disappeared into the current. It occurred too fast. The water was deep and swift. Before anyone could reach him, he was gone. Boys on the riverbank ran for assistance, and fishermen eventually pulled Joe out of the water. But by then, it was already finished. He had drowned. Jerry was only 5. Whether he clearly saw the drowning at that exact moment, or whether the story was told so many times that it became part of his memory, hardly changes the permanent harm. That image stayed with him. His father there 1 second and gone the next. Such a loss does not leave a child cleanly. It takes root in strange places and changes a person's internal shape. On February 20th, 1961, Jerry was traveling with friends near Palo Alto on Junipero Serra Boulevard. The vehicle was moving at a dangerous speed, around 90 miles per hour, when it hit a curve near the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital. The driver lost control. The car struck a guardrail and rolled over multiple times. Bodies were thrown violently. Jerry went through the windshield and landed in a field, torn completely out of his shoes. He lost consciousness during the ejection and woke up severely injured, with a broken collarbone and no memory of the exact moment he flew out. Around him, the destruction was everywhere. One friend had deep cuts to the abdomen, another had a fractured spine, another had a broken arm and concussion. But the worst part was this. Their friend Paul Spiegel never got out. The car crushed him. It was not merely a bad accident, it was a dividing line. As Jerry recovered, the horror of that night remained close. His friend was dead, he was alive. That kind of difference can either haunt a person or wake them up. For Jerry, it accomplished both. He later referred to it as his slingshot, a violent event that launched his life in a fresh direction. Before the crash, he had been wandering between interests, between art and music, between one version of himself and another. But afterward, the wandering began to fade. Guitar no longer felt like just one choice among many. It became urgent, essential. He once said that day was when his life truly started. That sounds dramatic, but perhaps only because it was true. Death had come close enough to touch, and once it had, half-hearted efforts no longer made sense. This explains why the following step carries so much importance. In the spring of 1961, still recovering from the Army disaster and the car wreck, Jerry secured his first paying performance with his new companion, Robert Hunter. They played folk songs together as Bob and Jerry and earned $5 each. That was it, barely anything. Hunter later joked that they almost should have framed the money before spending it. But that small payment represented something far greater than the amount. It was evidence that the force pulling Jerry forward could actually turn into a pathway. They performed in coffee houses, parking areas, and small local venues, carrying almost nothing except borrowed guitars, determination, and desire. Hunter contributed words. Jerry contributed emotion. Together, they began constructing a partnership that would define the essence of the Grateful Dead for many years. By 1965, Jerry and his band, then known as the Warlocks, were pushing through unpleasant performances in rough bars along the San Francisco Peninsula, accepting whatever work they could find. Some evenings the audience barely paid attention. Some evenings they were simply background noise. But while they were surviving in those rundown places, something odd and energetic was developing in Northern California. Ken Kesey had returned from his adventurous cross-country journey with the Merry Pranksters and welcomed the band to his property in La Honda. That invitation resulted in the first acid test. That night was not ordinary by any measure. Kool-Aid was laced, films were shown on walls. Homemade devices created thunder from wrecked car parts, paint glowed, and nothing was stable. Right in the middle of that disorder, the Warlocks connected their instruments and played. Jerry later remarked, the band completely devastated everyone. That first burst of sound was not refined or respectable. It was something more raw and unusual. But the audience felt it and demanded more. At that moment, the band stopped being just another struggling group and became part of a new world being formed in real time. Around that period, they recognized they needed a different name because another act was already using the Warlocks. They began searching for something else, something that felt suitable. The story exists in different forms, but its core remains unchanged. During an odd night at Phil Lesh's house, Jerry opened a dictionary and came across the phrase Grateful Dead. It originated from old folk stories about a traveler who buries an unknown dead person and is later rewarded by that spirit. The name was eerie, ancient, mythical, and somehow ideal. It contained death and compassion together. Death, mystery, and return. It felt both ancient and strangely alive. That was sufficient. The band had discovered its identity. After decades on the road, the band finally achieved a major mainstream success with Touch of Grey in 1987. You might think that would have felt like a victory, and in one sense it did. The song reached the Billboard Top 10, and MTV played the Skeleton Puppet video repeatedly. Suddenly, the Grateful Dead were visible in a way they had never been before. But success brought its own harm. Older fans looked at the flood of newcomers and saw people who did not comprehend the culture. They called them touchheads. Crowds grew larger and more chaotic, ticket scalping worsened, and parking areas became even more disorderly. Some venues no longer wanted the band around. The hit that appeared to be a triumph also made the scene more burdensome, less personal, and harder to keep together. By the early 1980s, Jerry Garcia was living with a secret that was consuming him. His heroin habit had grown into a $700 per day problem, and that kind of need does not stay small for long. It drains your money first, then your body, then whatever piece you still have remaining. What made it even more disturbing was that this was also the period when he was delivering some of the most captivating performances of his career. On stage, he still looked like Jerry. The guitar still seemed to soften in his hands. The notes still came alive. Yet behind that familiar smile was a man trapped by a needle, moving between brilliance and collapse. Night after night, every concert carried a strange tension. The audience saw magic, but behind the scenes his life was falling apart. It was not just money disappearing. It was his strength, his health, and his future, all being consumed while the music somehow continued. That could not go on forever. By January 5, 1985, the people closest to him had run out of patience and fear. His bandmates came to his home and forced the moment he had spent years avoiding. They presented him with a harsh choice: the band or the drugs. This was not some gentle discussion filled with vague worry. It was a desperate action from people who felt they were watching their friend die slowly. Garcia, exhausted and cornered, agreed to enter rehab. For a short time, that decision brought genuine relief. It felt as though the decline might have stopped, as though he might be ready to recover himself. But addiction like his was never just about wanting a substance. It was connected to fame, touring, pressure, tiredness, guilt, and the strange weight of being needed by so many people constantly. He was not simply attempting to quit a drug. He was trying to escape an entire way of living that had enclosed him like a cage. Then, almost right away, that hope broke. Only 2 weeks later, on January 19, 1985, Garcia was discovered nodding off in his car in Golden Gate Park. Around him was drug equipment, clear and impossible to deny. The image was painful in its contrast. Here was the man whose music had filled stadiums, whose songs carried freedom, wonder, and peace, now slumped in a parked car and drifting inside his own destruction. What had nearly become a story of recovery suddenly turned into something much more public and embarrassing. Instead of quietly entering rehab on his own terms, he ended up in front of a judge, and the court placed him into a drug diversion program. That mattered because it changed the meaning of the moment. Recovery was no longer just a personal promise. It had become a legal requirement. Even Golden Gate Park, a place that should have felt full of music and memory, became linked to one of the lowest points of his life. Still, 1985 was not a wasted year. For a while, Garcia truly did fight. One of the key people in that struggle was Nora Sage, his housekeeper, who became much more than that. She was a devoted fan, but also a reliable presence in a life that usually spun in circles. She kept him fed, looked after him, and assisted him through the slow process of detoxification. Under her care, he achieved periods of sobriety. The fog lifted enough for him to play again with clearer hands and sharper focus. For a short while, it seemed possible that he might finally settle into something healthier. But Garcia's life rarely remained stable for long. Fame never loosened its grip. The pressure returned, and the old exhaustion returned with it. By the spring of 1986, he was clean, at least temporarily. Yet, that did not mean his body had healed. Years of abuse had already caused deep damage, and once the drugs released their hold, the weakness beneath became harder to conceal. Before long, that damage would catch up with him in the most frightening way imaginable. Part of what made his struggle even more difficult was that some of the people around him were not protecting him at all. Rock Scully, the Grateful Dead's co-manager and Garcia's longtime friend, was fired in 1984 amid accusations that he had stolen money and enabled Garcia's addiction. That betrayal hurt deeply, but even that was not the heaviest burden Garcia carried. The larger weight came from expectation. When someone once asked why he did not simply walk away from everything, his answer revealed the trap he lived inside. He said, "Do you know how many people are depending on this show going down the road?" That single line says almost everything. He was not just a rock star trying to keep himself together. He was a man carrying the needs of a band, a crew, an audience, and an entire moving world built around his ability to keep appearing. Even as his own life cracked, he kept playing because too many people were relying on him to stop. Even after death, peace did not come easily. Garcia left behind an estate estimated at around $15 million, with annual earnings of roughly $2 million. But his will was thin and poorly prepared. What followed was years of legal conflict. Claims reportedly climbed past $50 million. Ex-wives, children, old friends, crew members, business associates, and even his custom guitar builder all came forward. Instead of grief settling quietly into memory, his life spilled into courtrooms. One of the most painful cases involved Carolyn Mountain Girl Adams, who argued that Garcia had promised her $250,000 per year for 20 years, a total of $5 million. In court, deeply private love letters he had written to her were read aloud as evidence. The whole situation turned intimate history into public ammunition. She first won, then faced appeals, and after years of fighting, eventually settled for much less. It was a mess full of money, resentment, and exposed wounds, the kind of ending that felt painfully distant from the warmth people associated with Garcia's music. Yet, even in the shadow of all that, his final performances and recordings began to take on a deeper meaning. On July 9, 1995, at Soldier Field in Chicago, Garcia stepped on stage looking fragile but still determined. The Grateful Dead opened with Touch of Grey, and more than 55,000 fans sang along to a chorus about survival, not knowing they were watching his last concert. His voice wavered, but that weakness gave the songs a raw human weight. He was no longer simply delivering lines. He seemed to be living inside them. Midway through the second set came So Many Roads, and that performance would become almost legendary in hindsight. Fans later said he looked ghostly in the spotlight, fragile yet glowing. His voice cracked on key lines, and the song no longer sounded like performance alone. It sounded like confession. By the time he reached the last words about easing his soul, the moment felt almost unbearably personal.